In order to construct the front panel, you will refer to page 4 in your PDF pattern, and we will only be doing step 1 at this point. You will notice that you have 4 panels to work with, 2 top and 2 bottom panels, and they're a perfect mirror image of each other. So the first thing we're going to do is assemble the top panels. You will take each piece and put them together, right sides together. Now these are exact replicas of each other, just mirrored images, so all edges at this point should match up perfectly. So you just want to make sure all of your edges are nicely aligned. And then you will either pin or clip on that center seam. I'm going to use clips at this point, but you can use pins if you prefer. And then you will take it over to the sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch allowance. Now, if your machine is like mine and does not have a 1/2 inch mark on the throat plate, you may want to mark it with some sort of a tape or something, just to make sure you have that perfect seam. And align the raw edge of your front panel with that 1/2 inch mark. Either lock stitch or back stitch at the beginning and the end to reinforce those stitches. I'm going to back stitch here. And I'm back stitching at the end. This will just ensure that your stitches will not come apart. So now you have a nice 1/2 inch seam allowance on your front. Then you take it to the serger, and again, as I mentioned earlier, the serging process is not necessary. If you don't have a serger, you can switch your sewing machine to a zigzag stitch and just zigzag the edge. All that does is just finish the edge nicely so it doesn't unravel in the wash. We're going to just serge the edge nicely. Just like that, and then you'll see that your front panel is put together now, and we want to press the seam towards the darker of the 2 fabrics, just so it doesn't show that ghost image in the front. So we are just pressing it towards the one side, just like this. I like to press from the back and then give it a nice press from the front. At this point, you can actually trim those serger tails because these will get sewn into the next seam, so you don't need them around. So that's your front panel. Don't top stitch right now because we do that at the very end. So now we are going to assemble the bottom panel, and this is done exactly the same way as we did the top. You put them right sides together. Make sure all of your edges are aligned because, again, these are mirrored pieces of each other, so you want to make sure everything is aligned. And then you can just pin along that center seam. You can use as many pins or as few pins as you'd like. Then you take it to the sewing machine and sew that 1/2 inch seam allowance just as you've done before. So there you have your front top and your front bottom already assembled. So now we are going to assemble the top to the bottom. We're going to join these 2 pieces, and as you see, We are going to be attaching a concave curve to a convex curve. Once you put them right sides together, you see the difference here and the way the curves curve in opposite directions of each other, but it's not as complicated as it seems. The important part here is to align that center seam. So the center seam from the top part and the center seam from the bottom part have to be perfectly aligned. So just make sure you got those two perfectly matched, and you can put a pin right there at the center. Your second and third pins will go at the corners. So you want to make sure you align those corners perfectly matched up together. You put one pin right here, and your third pin goes at the other corner, perfectly aligned. And then you can ease those two curves together. You'll see how easy it goes because the curves are not too drastic, so they pretty much sort of bend towards each other once you have them pinned. And you can put as many pins as you'd like, just to make sure those curves are not coming apart. I usually put 2 or 3 on one side, and then 2 or 3 on the other side. There it goes. So you're pretty much easing one curve onto the other. And just as you've done before, you can take this to your sewing machine and stitch that seam using a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Make sure your raw edge is lined up perfectly against that half-inch marking on your sewing machine, and that you back stitch or lock stitch at the beginning and end so that your seam does not come unraveled. Then you can take this to the serger or run a zigzag stitch on the edge as we've done before. When you serge, you can choose to cut off a little bit of the raw edge, or you can just serge at the end. There's really no right or wrong way. All we're really concerned about is finishing that edge so you have a nice professional finish. And then we take it to the ironing board, and this time we want to make sure we press the seam towards the top. So give that top piece a little tug just to make sure it's nice and straight, and press from the back. I can already see how nice that center seam looks, but I'll show you guys in a second. Then you can flip it around and press from the front. Look how beautiful this looks. It's like a perfect little X in the middle. Just give it a nice press from the front just to make sure that center panel does not have any bumps anywhere. Beautiful. So you pretty much can see how it's already coming together. The next step is to top stitch. Now we are first going to top stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. We will top stitch at the horizontal seam and at the vertical seam, and then I like to do another row of top stitching that's purely decorative, so you do not have to do this. But I love symmetry, and this is such a symmetrical dress that I thought, why not continue that symmetry into the top stitching. So a top stitching is just a decorative stitch that just pretty much locks that serge seam so it doesn't flip open like this. So we're gonna top stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the seam, and then again another 1/8 inch away on the other side of the seam, so you have perfect rows of top stitching that crisscross in the middle. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to lengthen my stitch by 1 millimeter. So instead of 2.5, I am now at 3.5 millimeters, because top stitching should always have a longer stitch length. All my other settings will stay the same as I had them for my regular sewing. And I'm lining up the edge of my seam with the edge of my presser foot. And I'm just going to begin top stitching. I backstitch too, just so it locks that stitch at the beginning. So our front panel is complete, and as you see, we have this beautiful symmetrical top stitching vertically and horizontally that pretty much frame that color blocked panels, and we are ready to start sewing the back panels now.